Welcome to Unit 18, Cardiovascular Part 2 and 3 for anatomy and physiology students. Keep in mind that in the first part of the cardiophysiology chapters in the lab manual, we talked about the cardiac anatomy, the anatomy of the heart, the blood flow, how the different components of the heart come together. And in the next two chapters, primarily this second chapter, Unit 18, we're going to talk about the anatomy of the blood vessels. Specifically in this chapter, we're going to be focusing on the branches of the arterial system, meaning that part of the circulation that relates to the blood carried through the arteries, branches of the aorta. Remember, the aorta comes off from the heart, it ascends up as the ascending aorta, makes a turn as the aortic arch, and then descends. So just before, keep in mind, the aorta makes all these different branches that we're going to talk about here. There are these openings for the coronary arteries. Let's not forget that. And then beyond that, again, we have multiple branches. Again, I will talk about some of the important veins in the body as well. But overall, when you are following the illustrations in the book, for this video, for this lecture, make sure to look at the arteries of the body. Again, arteries carry oxygenated blood, and we are primarily interested in the names of the arteries, what organs do they perfuse, where they are located in the body, and sort of what kind of branches come over where specifically anatomically throughout the region. Now again, as the aorta comes up from the heart after the aortic valve opens and makes that turn, that aortic arch. At the very top, we have three branches. We have the brachiocephalic artery, also called the innominate artery, the left common carotid artery, the left subclavian artery. Okay, so three branches: brachiocephalic, left common carotid, left subclavian. Now, just very briefly, I'm going to explain that. So when you see something like the word L and R, this is just abbreviation for left and right. When you see common, it means very often that that vessel is going to branch out into multiple others. And again, artery is just abbreviated as this little a for the purposes of this kind of a schematic. Obviously, in order to actually understand where these branches are located, you must see this in the book. You have to see the illustrations of the arteries to make sense of it, to understand it better. Now, okay, so the brachiocephalic goes up, then kind of makes a right turn towards the right side of the neck and right side of the right arm. And this one, it splits off into right subclavian artery and right common carotid. Now again, I'm gonna keep reminding you that essentially all of this is symmetrical. So whenever I say something's on the right side, there must be the same thing on the left side. So just to save space here, I didn't want to repeat myself multiple times for the right and left, so I wrote it usually just once. Okay, but obviously keep in mind, if there's a right artery, there has to be a left one as well. Okay, so for instance, on the right side, that right subclavian goes under the clavicle. All the arteries are just named according to where they are in the body. So if you were to take out the arteries like an autopsy and put them on a table, you'd actually not be able to tell most likely which one that is just by name, because it's out of context now, it's out of the body. But within the body, you can see where it's positioned, and we call it by that. Essentially, we use the terminology based on that specific location. So subclavian means under the clavicle, right? So that artery continues towards the arm, goes under the clavicle, then goes into the armpit area, so becomes axillary artery. Okay, so left one here, right one would be the same thing, just right axillary. And then this continues deeper into the arm, becomes obviously brachial artery, and then splits off as radial, ulnar, and on. And then the smaller branches towards the hand and the fingers. So again, subclavian, right subclavian specifically, would be branching off from the brachiocephalic. The left subclavian is a direct branch, the third branch from the aorta itself. Okay, that is an important discrepancy here anatomically that you want to keep in mind. Otherwise, everything else that happens beyond that is the same. Okay. Now, the other branch for brachiocephalic is the right common carotid. By the way, also here you would see the vertebral artery coming off. This is a branch going on towards the spinal cord. I kind of omitted it here, but you'll see that in the book. So what is going on with the carotid? Carotid essentially means neck. These are large neck arteries. Right common carotid continues upwards into the neck, and then getting closer to the head actually splits into the right external carotid and right internal carotid. The external carotid artery supplies all the features in the head besides the brain. So the bony skull, the muscles of the face, the skin, all the rest of the structures. The brain, on the other hand, has its own blood supply provided by the internal carotid. Okay, so obviously we have the right and left sides. So right external carotid again supplies the right side of the head, the face, the skin, the muscles, the bones, all those features, except for the brain, which is supplied by the internal carotid. Again, like I said, the same thing. It's going to be on the left side here, right? So when we come back here now, back to the aorta, the second branch, the left common carotid, will again become the left side, and the next split into left external carotid, left internal carotid, and so on like that. Later on, we'll come back to the internal carotid very briefly when we talk about a special set of arteries within the brain that have a certain kind of interesting kind of circulation. Now, coming back to the aorta again, the third branch, remember we already said was the left subclavian. Again, just becomes left axillary, left brachial, left radial, left ulnar, right? Like we already said before, right? Going now to the left arm, obviously. Now, during this portion, just before the aorta pierces through the diaphragm, this is the thoracic aorta. There's a few other minor branches that come off there that we are omitting here, but once the aorta actually passes through the diaphragm, it becomes an abdominal aorta. And most of the distance that the aorta travels in the body actually as abdominal aorta continues here all the way down to the iliacs, which is the portion, remember, where the pelvis essentially starts. When you hear the word iliac, right, reminding you of the iliac bones, the iliac crest. The very first branch of the abdominal aorta as it comes off under the diaphragm is the celiac trunk or the celiac artery. Right? This is a very short, stubby artery. It comes off immediately. It gives one branch off to the right side and some branches either down or to the left. So one branch here going towards the right would be the common hepatic artery. Hepatic means liver, right? Like hepatitis, inflammation of the liver. And then that artery splits into two, hepatic proper artery, or essentially hepatic artery going to the liver itself. And then remembering that we also have the other parts of the digestive system here, like the stomach and the duodenum. We have the gastroduodenal artery, essentially supplying, again, gastro means stomach, duodenal is the first part of the small intestine, and then also branching off as a right gastric, or the artery supplying the right side of the stomach. Coming back to the celiac, we also have the left gastric artery, that's for the left side of the stomach. Even though the stomach is a kind of medium-sized organ, it does have a very, very significant blood supply, as it's important for its function, and actually, again, receives the blood from the right and left gastric arteries, at the very least. And then the third branch of the celiac trunk is the splenic artery, right, going to the left. That's where we have the spleen. That's the organ that's necessary for immune function and has other significance there that we're going to talk about in other chapters. So very simple, usually straightforward. Splenic artery going straight to the spleen, again located on the left side. Remember, hepatic liver was located on the right side, spleen on the left side. Now, we give the aorta a little sort of break. There are no branches here. Then we'll continue a little bit further. Then we have another split. This is a SMA, or the superior mesenteric artery. Very long, fairly complex artery that branches off like a spider web throughout the upper portion of the intestinal tract. SMA supplies the pancreas and the small intestine, and essentially is very important to provide the blood supply to the digestive system. But again, because the digestive system is so large, we're going to have also yet another artery with a similar name further down as another branch of the aorta. Keep in mind also here, right below the SMA, right, we have the kidneys located close by in that area. The kidneys are supplied immediately by fairly short arteries, the renal arteries, the left and right renal. The kidneys need a very significant blood supply, so they're perfused constantly with large volume of blood, and they're located very closely in close proximity to the aorta. Right? The aorta, as it travels in the middle of the body, essentially, the kidneys are in that retroperitoneal space, kind of behind everything, behind the digestive organs, and are close to the aorta itself. Again, renal means kidneys. Kidneys are, remember, organs that filter blood, that are allowed to remove a lot of metabolic waste from our bloodstream, a very important critical function. And so they receive very significant blood supply, again, through these renal arteries. A little bit further down, we have, again, the mesenteric arteries. The word mesenteric, again, reminds us that this is dealing with the digestive system. We have the superior mesenteric, now we have the IMA, the inferior mesenteric arteries. These supply basically parts of the large intestine now, and essentially, right, are kind of located this lower portion, almost kind of at the pelvis area. Once we get across into the pelvis, we now finally end the aorta, and we can split into left and right common iliac arteries. And again, iliacs reminds us that we are in the pelvis. And so on the right side, we have the right internal iliacs and left and right external iliac, and on the left side, left internal iliac and left external iliacs. The way we're going to separate them is that essentially the internal iliacs are going to go straight into the pelvis and remain there to supply the organs in the pelvis, which is the muscles, the bones of the pelvis, reproductive system, urinary tract like the bladder, those organs. And then the external iliacs are actually going to continue further into our lower extremities, into the legs, to supply them with blood, right? So obviously legs have muscles, bones, those structures, and the external iliacs become as the femoral arteries, which actually branch out further into like deep femoral arteries and continue on. I'm not naming any other smaller branches here, but again, you can see their names in the book, in the illustrations. This pretty much covers most of the branches, most of the most important blood vessels that I want to talk about. Now let's go over some of the additional information that we have in this chapter. Besides looking at the simple branchings of the aorta, we also talk about some other forms of circulation. So like I said before, when you think about the internal carotids going into the brain, right, and kind of at the base of the brain, providing the branches, those branches actually make up a circle to allow a continuous blood supply there with some redundancy, so there is no interruption of blood in case if there's any kind of blockage. This circle of blood vessels, again, arterial circle, right, with oxygenated blood traveling there, is called the circle of Willis. It's fairly small. It's located at the base of the brain, again, supplied through the right and left internal carotid arteries. There are multiple branches through there, and then they kind of spread out throughout the brain to provide it with blood supply. The brain is one of the most blood hungry sort of organ, right? It receives enormous amounts of nutrients, oxygen, and glucose, more so than pretty much any other organ in the body, because there are so many neurons and other cells there, and they're very demanding in terms of energy, and obviously are constantly working to control the entire organ, the entire organism. So the circle of Willis, again, allows the blood supply to go to the brain and creates this sort of repetition of blood supply to make sure that if there's any interruption, the blood can have like a detour to still continue perfusing the brain, and it's not going to leave the brain starved of oxygen and nutrients. Again, make sure to see the circle of Willis in the illustrations in the book. Another interesting blood supply is a little bit different, and this is what's called the hepatic portal system. When you're thinking about what the liver does, the liver essentially is an organ that takes the blood from the digestive system. So when you're eating a meal, those molecules that need to be broken down, before they reach our cells, they actually go into the portal system on their way to the liver. And the liver, using its enzymes, using hepatocytes, actually processes all the nutrients and the molecules that you've digested orally. So the hepatic portal system is a venous system, right? The blood does not provide oxygen here to the liver, but just basically takes the blood from the digestive system, those molecules that you're trying to break down, trying to metabolize, carries them to the liver for processing, and then the liver allows, after processing, those molecules to continue into the bloodstream. Because of this, the liver essentially has like a triple blood supply. It has the regular arterial blood providing oxygen. It has obviously veins coming out the venous system, and then the third one is again another venous system, another set of blood vessels, which is that portal system from the digestive tract. Again, make sure to look at the illustrations that we have in the book, the lab manual for the hepatic portal system. Just basically in terms of the naming, very kind of brief summary. There's quite a lot of arteries and veins named in the body. They are named sometimes based on where they're located, but once they get fairly small, the arteries are now called arterioles. And then as they get smaller and smaller, they finally become the capillaries. Capillaries, remember, are the smallest microscopic blood vessels. Again, we cannot see them with our eyes. We need a microscope to visualize them. These are the smallest vessels with the thinnest wall, where the diffusion of oxygen and CO2 can occur very quickly. And then as the blood needs to return now back to the heart through the venous system, it's kind of getting collected. We now start with the smallest veins first, right? Start with the capillaries, then smallest veins. These are called venules, and then they become larger and larger veins, and then two largest veins in the body finally kind of join there, and that's the inferior and superior vena cava, or vena cava, IVC and SVC. Okay, those that go into the right atrium of the heart. Now, cross-section of a blood vessel, right, you see this under a microscope on histology. Basically, both arteries and veins are fairly similar, especially the larger ones. Overall, the general view of a cross-section when you cut a blood vessel, that inner space where the blood is actually traveling is the lumen. And we have these three layers in general, right, for most blood vessels. Again, for the exception of capillaries, capillaries often just have one layer, only that endothelial lining, because again, they allow, they need those flat squamous cells to allow diffusion to occur very quickly, right? But for larger blood vessels, we will have this extra support tissue. Sometimes we'll have smooth muscle layers, sometimes we have elastic fibers, other structures there to maintain the proper function of the blood vessel, to allow the blood vessel sometimes to dilate, to constrict, right, depending on where it's located and what it's doing. Again, the main general layers of a blood vessel, again, whether it's an artery or vein, the deepest layer is the endothelial lining. This is the one that consists of endothelial cells. These are like epithelial cells, except they're inside, so they're called endothelial cells, and they directly interact with platelets and other components of the blood. The next layer, usually much larger, is either you can say the middle layer or the media. This one often is the one that contains the internal elastic lamina, which appears as darkly stained, kind of wavy line under a microscope, consisting of elastic fibers, right, to make sure that the blood vessel has that flexibility when it dilates or constricts, and kind of providing that support to the vessel. And then the outer layer, which varies by size. As you can see, this is not to scale, obviously. That would be either we call it external layer or the adventitia. And this one, again, will have collagen fibers, other support tissue, things like that, to provide that extra stability again to the blood vessel. So the three layers are endothelial lining, media, adventitia. In the very largest of the blood vessels, like the aorta, we might also see the final, very thin, kind of protective capsule-like almost structure called the serosa. This is just similar, like we talked about, many organs having a protective membrane on the outside, and again, for the largest blood vessels, we have that serosa here as well. But again, most blood vessels would not have them as a true layer. Now, in the third chapter in the cardiovascular system, there's all kinds of different topics there, but very briefly, I want to go over some of the cardiovascular physiology, specifically some information about the heart rate and the blood pressure. The heart rate, actually is basically when you measure someone's pulse, right? How the heart is beating, the rhythm there, how many beats per minute normally you expect someone's pulse to be or the heart rate to be. So if considering the normal heart rate, this is usually between 60 to 100 beats per minute physiologically. So anyone who has a heart rate that is less than 60 beats per minute, we usually would call this bradycardia or slow heart rate. And someone's heart rate is above 100 beats per minute, usually this will be tachycardia. And again, obviously this has to do with either pathology or physiology. So if you're exercising, if you're running, obviously you expect your heart rate to be elevated. That is normal. But again, under certain pathological conditions, it's possible to have tachycardia, elevated heart rate in case of like arrhythmia, and when a person is just maybe sitting still doing nothing particularly difficult or complex, or not exerting themselves, but still for some reason the heart rate is significantly elevated, right? This would be like a pathological state of tachycardia. Again, bradycardia, slow heart rate, tachycardia, above normal or faster heart rate. For blood pressure, right, blood pressure is a fairly complex topic, but essentially it's related to the measurement of systolic over diastolic pressure. Systolic refers to the contraction part of the heart, and diastolic refers to the dilation of the chambers. Right? So as the heart contracts, as it beats, there's the contraction component of the ventricles, the chambers, and the relaxation component. So systolic, diastolic measure the units of millimeters of mercury. A person could have normal blood pressure, they could be normotensive, they could be hypertensive, or pressures higher than normal, or could be hypotensive, which is lower than normal. Right? So somebody who is normotensive, I'm going to say the blood pressure should be around 120 over 80 or 120 over 70 millimeters of mercury. So we write it as mmHg, those are the units. Again, the top number should always be bigger than the lower number. So again, around 120 over 80, a little bit less than that maybe. That's around the normal blood pressure. And someone who for sure has hypertension or is hypertensive above normal, this could be a source of significant pathology, even though a person might not have any symptoms of this, because with long-term chronic hypertension, blood vessels, kidneys, other organs begin to get damaged as the high pressure kind of scraping through the endothelial linings. Basically, again, essentially causes damage to the heart, kidneys, and other organs. And that's why it must be treated. So what is actually hypertension in terms of the numbers? Usually we're going to say it's around above 140 over 90 for sure, and could go significantly higher above that. 140 over 90 millimeters of mercury for hypertension. Again, these numbers not written in stone. You'll see different numbers in the book and other sources. But we're going to, right, for the sake of purposes of easier kind of memorization, we're going to kind of stick to these numbers. And for the hypotension or blood pressure that is lower than normal, we're going to say something lower than 90 over 50. Keep in mind, so most people who receive blood pressure medication, they have hypertension, what we call often essential hypertension, but we do not really know what's actually causing that high blood pressure, but it still needs to be treated with medication. And when someone is hypotensive, usually not a chronic condition, but something could occur in kind of abrupt moments. Something like orthostatic hypotension refers to something when you, for instance, get up off the bed and feel a little bit dizzy in the morning. When you very quickly change the position, the body doesn't have enough time to compensate for that change. And that very abrupt and kind of sharp drop in blood pressure causes lack of oxygen to go to the brain for that very, very small instance, and that causes some of that dizziness that a person might feel. So again, even though that doesn't necessarily need to be treated, the person often recovers quickly, or this takes place very rarely, but still that was an instance of low blood pressure, right? Hypotension. And there's also other causes of both hypertension, kinds of other pathology associated with that is beyond the discussion here. When you're reviewing this chapter again, primarily again, Unit 18, make sure to look at the illustrations of the blood vessels, just like we looked at the illustrations of the of the cardiac anatomy of the heart in the previous chapter. See where the arteries are, see where these different systems are, like the circulobulous hepatic portal system, the cross section of the blood vessels. Take a look at the histology as well to get familiar with these areas and this topic from the point of view of anatomy.